The starch in Yugama's white shirt was so stiff it felt like paper against her skin. Every morning, she tucked her past away. She hid her medical degree under a black vest. She hid her pride behind a silver name tag. In this dimly lit lounge, she was not a woman who had spent years studying the ethics of medicine. She was a shadow with a tray. She was a ghost in a uniform. Being invisible was her only way to survive. 3 years ago, Yugama had been a rising star in a world of lab coats and high-level research. She was the one who asked the hard questions. When a giant pharmaceutical company tried to hide the side effects of a new drug, she didn't stay quiet. She spoke up. She thought the truth would protect her, but the truth had burned her life to the ground. The company was too big and too powerful. They didn't just fire her, they erased her. They put her name on a secret blacklist that reached every hospital and lab in the country. Now, instead of saving lives, she polished wine glasses until they sparkled like diamonds. Instead of analyzing blood work, she memorized the favorite appetizers of men who didn't even look at her face. The lounge was a place for the elite. It smelled of expensive cigars and heavy cologne. The lights were low to hide the faces of people making deals they didn't want the world to see. Yugama moved through the room like a breeze. She was fast, silent, and forgotten the moment she walked away from a table. She had learned to keep her head down and her ears closed. That was the rule for a blacklisted woman. Don't be noticed. She stopped at a side station to check her reflection in a polished toaster. Her dark eyes looked tired. She missed the sterile, bright lights of the lab. She missed the feeling of doing something that mattered. Here, the only thing that mattered was the temperature of the champagne. Table 4 is ready for the vintage red, her manager whispered, nudging her shoulder. Yugama took a deep breath. Table 4 was the private booth in the corner. It was occupied by Hyunwoo Choi, a man whose reputation was as dark as the tattoos that climbed up his neck and disappeared under his jaw. He was a man of power, the kind of man who could buy or sell the very building she stood in. She picked up the heavy bottle of wine. The glass was cold and smooth. As she walked toward the booth, she felt a familiar pang of bitterness. Her debts were piling up. Her old life felt like a dream she was slowly forgetting. She told herself that this was her reality now. She was just a waitress. She was just a girl from Nigeria trying to pay for a tiny apartment. But as she approached the table, she saw the men. Hyunwoo sat with his back to the wall, his eyes sharp and steady. Beside him was an associate in a sharp suit, a man who smiled too much. They were speaking in Korean, a language they assumed no one else in this room could possibly understand. They didn't know that Yugama had spent years working on international research teams. They didn't know she had spent hundreds of hours learning their language so she could read their medical journals. To them, she was just the uniformed ghost. She was someone who cleared the plates and stayed silent. She stood at the edge of the table, the wine bottle held perfectly against her side. She waited for a break in their conversation to offer the service. But then a word caught her ear. A medical term. A specific dosage. The smiling associate leaned closer to Hyunwoo. He spoke about a medication switch. He spoke about a heart complication that would look like a tragic accident. He spoke about Hyunwoo's young daughter. Yugama's hand didn't shake, but her heart began to race. The moral compass she had tried so hard to break was suddenly spinning wildly. She wasn't just hearing a business deal. She was hearing a murder being planned in real time. She was the only person in the world who knew the chemistry of the lie they were telling. She stood there, frozen between two worlds. In one world, she was the waitress who poured the wine and went home to her lonely life. In the other, she was the investigator who knew that the man to the right was a snake. The air in the booth felt heavy. The associate looked up at her, his eyes cold and dismissing. He waved a hand for her to start pouring. He thought she was nobody. He thought she was just part of the scenery. Yugama looked at the bottle in her hand. The red wine inside looked like blood. If she poured it, the celebration would begin, and a little girl's life would end. She had spent 3 years trying to be invisible, trying to be a ghost so she wouldn't get hurt again. But as she looked into the hard, unsuspecting eyes of Hyunwoo Choi, she realized that some ghosts have voices that cannot stay buried. Yugama moved toward the table with the grace of someone who had practiced being invisible for 1,000 nights. The heavy bottle of red wine felt like a lead weight in her hand. She arrived at the edge of the booth, just as the associate, a man with a sharp nose and restless eyes named Mr. Park, was pointing at a map spread out on the table. Hyunwoo Choi did not look up. He was leaning back, his large frame filling the leather seat. The tattoos on his hands were visible as he tapped a rhythm on the table. He looked tired, but his eyes were like two dark stones. To him, Yugama was just a shadow providing a service. Mr. Park continued to speak in Korean, his voice low and smooth. He was explaining the details of a new shipment of medical supplies. To anyone else in the lounge, it sounded like boring business talk about trucks and delivery times. But Yugama's ears were tuned to a different frequency. She listened to the words he used, words for safe passage and inventory, but her mind instantly translated the true meaning behind his tone. The shipment will arrive at the warehouse at midnight, Mr. Park said in Korean, his finger tracing a line on the paper. I have told the guards to step away so the transition can happen quietly. It is all for the sake of the new expansion. But Yugama noticed a flicker in Mr. Park's eyes. He wasn't talking about expansion. He was using a specific slang word for clearing the path that she had heard in her years of investigating corrupt labs. He wasn't just moving medicine. He was moving people out of the way so a hit could take place. He was telling Hyunwoo that the area was safe, while actually setting a trap where no one would be around to help. Yugama stepped forward to begin the service. She reached for the first glass, her movements steady despite the storm in her chest. As she leaned in, she caught the scent of Mr. Park's expensive cologne. It was sweet and cloying, like something used to cover up a bad smell. Would you like to taste the vintage first, sir? She asked in English, her voice a calm, professional hum. Hyunwoo gave a short nod, barely acknowledging her. Mr. Park, however, looked at her with a flash of annoyance. He didn't like being interrupted. He switched to English for a brief second to snap at her. Just pour it. We are busy, he said, his voice sharp. He immediately turned back to Hyunwoo and returned to their native tongue. He began to describe the logistics of the shipment again. He told Hyunwoo that the driver was a loyal man who had been with the family for years. But Yugama knew the name he mentioned. In the world of medical research and ethics, that name was linked to a man who had been banned for falsifying records. Mr. Park was lying about the man's loyalty. He was handpicking a traitor to drive the truck. Yugama felt a cold chill run down her spine. The associate was like a snake, weaving a beautiful basket of lies and inviting his boss to step inside. Each word he spoke was a brick in a wall that would eventually trap Hyunwoo and his daughter. As she tilted the bottle, the dark liquid began to flow into the glass. It made a soft, gurgling sound in the quiet booth. Yugama watched the wine swirl. In her mind, she wasn't seeing grapes, she was seeing the chemical formulas she used to study. She was seeing the way a lie could be just as poisonous as a needle full of the wrong medicine. She realized then that Mr. Park wasn't just mistranslating the logistics. He was rewriting the truth in real time. He was telling Hyunwoo that the daughter's new nurse was a specialist from the best hospital. But the details he gave about the specialist's background were wrong. He mentioned a clinic that Yugama knew had been shut down for malpractice years ago. Mr. Park smiled at Hyunwoo, a look of fake concern on his face. She is in good hands, he whispered in Korean. The medicine will be delivered tonight, and she will sleep peacefully. Yugama's hand tightened on the bottle. She knew what sleep peacefully meant when it was said by a man like Mr. Park. He wasn't talking about a good night's rest. He was talking about a permanent sleep. She looked at Hyunwoo Choi. The man was powerful, feared by everyone in the city, yet he was sitting right next to his greatest enemy and didn't even know it. He was a lion being led into a cage by a fox. Yugama finished pouring the first glass. She should have moved to the next one. She should have stepped back and disappeared into the shadows of the lounge. That was what a uniformed ghost was supposed to do. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The language of snakes was filling the booth, and she was the only one who had the map to the exit. She looked at the red wine in the glass. It reflected the dim light of the lounge, looking like a dark, dangerous eye. She realized that if she walked away now, she was just as guilty as the man telling the lies. Silence wasn't just safety anymore. It was a weapon that Mr. Park was using, and she was the one holding the handle. Mr. Park reached for his glass, his fingers trembling just a little bit with excitement. He thought he had won. He thought the waitress was just a piece of furniture that didn't understand the death warrant he had just signed. Yugama took a breath. The air thick with the smell of the wine and the copper tang of fear. She had spent years being quiet. She had spent years being a ghost. But as the snake leaned in to toast to a successful deal, Yuganma Isaac decided that the ghost was tired of being invisible. Yuganma moved to the second glass. But her movements were slower now. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a scientist listening to a crime. Mr. Park leaned even closer to Hyunwoo, his voice dropping to a low crawl. He thought the soft music in the lounge would drown out his words. He thought the woman in the black vest was as deaf as the walls. In Korean, Mr. Park began to describe the new treatment for Hyunwoo's daughter. He spoke about a specific vial of clear liquid that would be added to her nightly drip. He called it a vitamin booster meant to strengthen her heart. But as he whispered the name of the chemical compound and the dosage, Yuganma felt a jolt of electricity run through her fingers. Her mind raced back to the cold, white labs of her past. She remembered the thick textbooks and the late nights of research. The name Mr. Park used wasn't a vitamin. It was a potent beta blocker that, in a high dose, would slow a child's heart until it simply stopped. It wouldn't leave a trace. It would look like a natural failure, a tragic medical accident that no doctor could explain. "It will work quickly," Mr. Park whispered, a thin smile touching his lips. "The nurse has been instructed to give the full dose at midnight. By the time the sun rises, the problem will be gone, and the inheritance will be secure." Yuganma felt sick. She was looking at the bottle of wine in her hand, but in her mind, she was seeing a hospital room. She saw a small girl sleeping in a bed, unaware that the person supposed to protect her was actually a monster. The lethal prescription was already written. The associate wasn't just planning a coup for the company. He was murdering a child to clear his path to the top. She realized why Mr. Park was so confident. The drug he mentioned was rare. Most people, even some doctors, wouldn't recognize the danger of that specific dosage. But Yuganma was a medical ethics investigator. She had spent her career hunting down pharmaceutical companies that tried to hide these exact kinds of lethal side effects. She knew the chemistry of this murder like she knew her own name. Hyunwoo Choi sat perfectly still. He looked relieved, almost grateful. He truly believed his daughter was finally getting the help she needed. "You are sure about this, doctor?" Hyunwoo asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I cannot lose her." "I am certain," Mr. Park replied. "He is the best in the field. He has never failed a patient." Yuganma's heart hammered against her ribs. Every word out of Mr. Park's mouth was a lie wrapped in a professional bow. The doctor was a fraud, and the medicine was a death sentence. She stood there with the wine bottle, a witness to a murder that hadn't happened yet. She knew what would happen if she stayed silent. She would go home, count her tips, and sleep in her small, quiet apartment. And somewhere across the city, a heart would stop beating because she was too afraid to speak. She had been blacklisted for telling the truth once before. She had lost everything, her career, her money, her reputation. She had promised herself she would never stick her neck out again. But the uniformed ghost was starting to feel the weight of her old soul. She looked at the associate. He looked so smug, so sure of his victory. He looked at Yuganma as if she were a piece of wood, a tool to be used and ignored. He didn't realize that the woman pouring his wine was the only person in the room who could see the poison in his words. The air in the VIP lounge felt thinner now. The scent of the expensive wine was no longer sweet. It smelled like the sterile hallways of the hospitals that had turned her away. Yuganma realized that her medical training hadn't just been a tool for her old job. It was a gift that she couldn't throw away, even if the world had thrown her away. She finished pouring the wine for Mr. Park. The dark red liquid sat in his glass, shimmering under the dim lights. It was time for the toast. It was the moment where the deal would be sealed and the plan would be set in motion. Mr. Park raised his glass toward Hyunwoo, his eyes gleaming with a hidden, cruel light. Yuganma didn't step back. She didn't disappear into the shadows. She stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the glass of wine that looked like a pool of blood. She had decoded the plot. She knew the time, the dose, and the killer. Now, she had to decide if she was willing to die to keep a child alive. Yuganma held the bottle over the final glass, but her fingers refused to obey. For 3 years, she had been a machine. She had been a person who moved, served, and cleaned without a single mistake. But now, the weight of the lethal prescription was too heavy. A small, rhythmic shaking started in her right hand. It was a tiny movement, no more than the fluttering of a bird's wing, but against the silent backdrop of the VIP booth, it felt like an earthquake. The neck of the wine bottle rattled against the rim of the crystal glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was small, but in the quiet space between Mr. Park's lies. It sounded like a bell. Mr. Park froze. His smile didn't vanish, but it turned sharp and cold. He looked up at Yaganma, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see a person, he saw a broken tool. He reached out to steady the glass, his hand brushing against hers. His skin was warm, but his touch felt like ice. "Watch what you are doing," Mr. Park hissed in English. "You are spilling the vintage." Yaganma didn't pull away. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the red liquid inside the glass. In her mind, the wine was transforming. It was no longer a drink for a celebration. It was the symbol of a life about to be extinguished. She saw the little girl's face, a face she had never met, but one she felt responsible for. If she finished this pour, she was part of the murder. If she stepped back, she was a coward. Suddenly, a large, scarred hand reached out and gripped the table. The tapping stopped. Hyunwoo Choi shifted his weight. He didn't look at Mr. Park. He didn't look at the wine. He looked directly at Yaganma's face. For the first time that night, the uniformed ghost was being seen. His gaze was heavy and searching, like he was trying to read the secrets hidden behind her tired eyes. He noticed the way her jaw was set. He noticed that she wasn't looking at him with the fear of a waitress who was about to be fired. She was looking at the table with the intensity of a surgeon. "You are shaking," Hyunwoo said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air in the booth. He spoke in English, his words slow and deliberate. "She is just tired, sir," Mr. Park interrupted quickly, his voice tight with fake kindness. He waved a hand at Yaganma, motioning for her to leave. "Go. Send someone else to finish this. You are dismissed." Yaganma felt the pull of safety. All she had to do was turn around. She could walk through the swinging doors of the kitchen, take off her vest, and disappear into the night. She could stay a ghost. She could stay alive. But the tremor in her hand grew stronger. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a physical rejection of the lie. Her medical ethics, the very thing that had destroyed her career, was screaming at her to stand her ground. She thought of the pharmaceutical company that had ruined her life. They had counted on her being quiet. Mr. Park was counting on her being quiet. Everyone always thought that a woman in a uniform had no voice. Hyunwoo leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He ignored Mr. Park completely. "Why is your hand shaking?" he asked again. "It is not the wine. You are looking at my associate like he is a disease." The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Park's face went pale. He looked between the boss and the waitress, his breath hitching in his throat. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Like a string pulled so tight it was about to snap and cut everyone in the room. Yaganma looked at Hyunwoo Choi. She saw the pain of a father hidden behind the mask of a monster. She realized that the truth was a fire. It could burn you, but it could also light the way. She stopped trying to hide the tremor. She let the bottle rest on the table with a firm thud. "I am shaking," Yaganma said, her voice low but steady, "because I am deciding if I should let you drink to a death, or if I should stop it." The world seemed to stop. Mr. Park gasped, his hand flying to his chest. Hyunwoo's eyes widened, a flash of pure, dangerous curiosity crossing his face. The uniformed ghost had spoken, and the language she used was the truth. The silence in the booth was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Mr. Park's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He reached for the bottle Yaganma had placed on the table, his fingers clawing at the glass. "You are insane," Mr. Park shouted, his voice cracking. "How dare you speak to us this way? Get out. Guards, get this woman out of here." But Yaganma did not move. She felt as if her feet were made of stone. The fear that had lived in her chest for 3 years was suddenly gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She reached out and placed her hand firmly on top of the wine bottle, pinning it to the table before Mr. Park could grab it. "I will not pour this wine," Yaganma said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the quiet lounge like a physical blow. In a place like this, there were rules. A waitress never touched a guest. A waitress never interrupted a deal. And most of all, a waitress never looked a man like Hyunwoo Choi in the eye and told him no. By refusing to serve, Yaganma was breaking the sacred code of the lounge. She was stripping off her uniform in front of everyone and showing the professional woman underneath. Mr. Park stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He looked at Hyunwoo, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and panic. "Sir, I am so sorry. This woman is clearly sick. She has lost her mind. I will have her dealt with immediately." Hyunwoo Choi did not move. He sat perfectly still, his large hands resting on the table. He looked at Yuganma's hand, dark, steady, and firm against the glass bottle. Then he looked up at her face. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated, the way a person looks at a puzzle they can finally solve. "You refuse?" Hyunwoo asked. The words were quiet, but they felt dangerous. "I refuse," Yuganma replied. She didn't blink. "This wine is for a celebration you will not live to see if you trust the man to your right. To pour this glass is to sign a death warrant for your daughter. And I will not have her blood on my hands." The room went ice cold. Mr. Park let out a choked sound, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "She's lying. She doesn't even know what she's saying. She's just a waitress." Yuganma turned her gaze to Mr. Park. For the first time, she let the uniformed ghost die completely. She used the tone she had once used in boardrooms and research labs, the tone of a woman who knew exactly what she was talking about. "I am an investigator," she said, switching her speech. She began to speak in Korean, her accent perfect and her words sharp. "I know the name of the drug you mentioned. I know that 12 milligrams of that beta blocker will stop a child's heart in less than an hour. I know the clinic you mentioned was closed for fraud. And I know that you are not a loyal associate. You are a killer in a cheap suit." Mr. Park staggered back, as if she had slapped him. The fact that she was speaking his language, the secure language he had used to hide his crimes, was the final blow. The walls he had built around his secret were crumbling. Hyunwoo Choi slowly stood up. He was a head taller than everyone else, and his presence filled the booth like a dark cloud. He looked at Mr. Park, then back at Yuganma. The guards from the front of the lounge were already moving toward the table, their hands on their belts, but Hyunwoo held up one hand to stop them. "Wait," Hyunwoo commanded. He leaned in close to Yuganma. He was so close she could see the tiny lines around his eyes and smell the faint scent of wood smoke on his jacket. He looked at her name tag, then ripped it off her vest and tossed it onto the table. "You are not a waitress," he whispered. "A waitress follows orders. You are something else." "I am a witness," Yuganma said, her voice never wavering. At that moment, the manager of the lounge rushed over, his face red with embarrassment. "Mr. Choi, I am so sorry." "Yuganma, what are you doing? You are fired. Get out right now before I call the police." Yuganma didn't even look at the manager. She kept her eyes on Hyunwoo. She had crossed the line. She had broken the omerta, the silence that kept the lounge running. She knew that by speaking, she had ended her life as a ghost. There was no going back to the kitchen now. There was no going back to her quiet, lonely apartment. Hyunwoo Choi picked up the wine bottle that Yuganma had refused to pour. He looked at the label, then looked at Mr. Park, who was now sweating through his expensive shirt. "She says this wine is for a death," Hyunwoo said to his associate. He held the bottle out toward Mr. Park. "If she is lying, you will drink the first glass. If she is telling the truth." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told everyone exactly what would happen. Yuganma stood her ground, her heart beating fast but her spirit finally free. She was no longer a shadow. She was a woman standing in the light of the truth, even if that light was about to burn everything down. Hyunwoo Choi held the wine bottle like a weapon. The dark red liquid inside sloshed against the glass, looking thick and heavy. He did not look at the guards or the nervous manager who was still hovering nearby. He only looked at Mr. Park, whose face was now the color of old paper. "Drink," Hyunwoo said. It wasn't a request. It was a command that carried the weight of a mountain. "Mr." Park's hands flew to his throat. He looked at the glass on the table, the one Yuganma had refused to finish pouring. "Sir, please," he stammered, his voice thin and high. "She is a nobody. She is a girl who cleans floors. Why would you listen to her over me? I have served you for years." "And yet," Hyunwoo said, stepping closer until he was looming over the smaller man, "you are the one who is shaking now. She is standing as still as a statue." He turned his gaze back to Yuganma. His eyes were like cold fire, searching for any sign that she was playing a game. "You spoke of a drug. You spoke of a dosage. Tell me exactly what you heard." Yuganma took a step forward. She ignored the manager's gasps and the stares of the other elite guests who were now watching the drama from a distance. She focused only on the facts. The medical investigator in her had taken over completely. "He told you it was a heart booster," Yuganma said, her voice clear and steady. "But the name he used in Korean, the one he thought I didn't know, is a high-concentration beta blocker. In a healthy adult, it might just slow the pulse. But for a child who is already weak, like your daughter, it will cause her heart to stop. It happens slowly, so it looks like she just fell asleep and never woke up. It is the perfect murder because no one thinks to look for it. She looked at Mr. Park, who was trying to edge away toward the exit. He also told you the nurse was from the St. Jude Clinic. I know that clinic. It was shut down 2 years ago for taking bribes from pharmaceutical companies. The nurse isn't there to help your daughter. She is there to make sure the medicine is given at exactly midnight. Hyunwoo's face went stone cold. The mention of his daughter's name and the specific details of her care seemed to hit him harder than a physical blow. He reached out and grabbed Mr. Park by the collar, lifting him nearly off the ground. Is this true? Hyunwoo roared. She's making it up. Mr. Park cried out, his legs dangling. How could a waitress know about medical clinics and heart drugs? Yugama didn't wait for him to finish his lie. I know because I was the one who wrote the report that shut that clinic down. My name is Yugama Isaac. I was a lead investigator for medical ethics before people like you paid to have me erased. The name seemed to mean something to Hyunwoo. He stared at her, his grip on Mr. Park tightening. He saw the truth in her eyes, the tired, honest look of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He dropped Mr. Park onto the floor. The associate collapsed in a heap, gasping for air. Hyunwoo looked at the wine in the glass. It was supposed to be a toast to a successful partnership, but now it just looked like a cup of poison. He picked up the glass and tipped it over, watching the red wine soak into the expensive white tablecloth. It spread out like a dark, blooming flower, a symbol of the blood that would have been shed if Yugama had stayed a ghost. The midnight dose, Hyunwoo whispered, mostly to himself. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He had 2 hours to save his child. He turned to his lead guard, a tall man who had been standing silently in the shadows. Take him, Hyunwoo said, pointing at the shivering Mr. Park. Find out who else is involved. And call the house. Tell them to lock the doors and keep the nurse away from my daughter. If she so much as touches a needle, she does not leave that room alive. The guards moved in quickly, dragging Mr. Park away as he screamed for mercy. The lounge went silent again, but the tension didn't leave the air. It just shifted. Hyunwoo Choi turned to Yugama. He looked at her tattered name tag on the table, and then at her plain, starch-stiff uniform. He saw the woman who had sacrificed her safety to save a child she didn't even know. You broke the rules of this place to tell me this, Hyunwoo said. You knew what would happen to you. I've been a ghost for 3 years, Mr. Choi, Yugama said, her voice finally beginning to show a hint of the exhaustion she felt. I decided tonight that I was tired of being dead. Hyunwoo nodded slowly. He didn't thank her. Not yet, but the way he looked at her was different now. It wasn't the look a master gives a servant. It was the look one survivor gives another. You are coming with me, he said. If you are right about the medicine, you are the only one I trust to check it. If you are wrong, he didn't need to finish the threat. Yugama knew the stakes. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the fire, and there was no turning back. The black car moved through the city like a bullet. Inside, the air was silent and cold. Hyunwoo Choi sat in the back seat, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yugama sat beside him, still wearing her waitress vest, feeling the strange weight of the leather seats and the even heavier weight of the life that was currently in her hands. 20 minutes until midnight, Hyunwoo said, his voice a low growl. He was clutching his phone, so hard his knuckles were white. When they arrived at the house, a massive fortress of glass and stone, the gates swung open before the car even stopped. Hyunwoo was out of the door before the engine died, and Yugama followed close behind. The guards in the hallway stepped aside, their faces pale. They knew their boss was in a state of quiet, deadly fury. They reached the daughter's bedroom on the 2nd floor. Outside the door, 2 of Hyunwoo's personal guards held a woman in a white nurse's uniform against the wall. She was crying and shouting that she had done nothing wrong, but her eyes darted toward a small medical tray on a rolling cart. The needle, Yugama said, pointing. Hyunwoo pushed past the guards and entered the room. A small girl, no older than 7, lay in a large bed. She looked frail, her skin almost the same color as the white sheets. She was hooked up to a machine that went beep, 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 in a slow, steady rhythm. Yugama didn't wait for permission. She walked straight to the medical tray. She saw a syringe filled with a clear liquid, lying next to a small glass vial. She picked up the vial and held it to the light. Her eyes scanned the tiny print on the label. "This is it," Yuganma whispered. "It is exactly what I heard in the lounge. Can you stop it?" Hyunwoo asked. He was standing by his daughter's side, his hand hovering over her hair but afraid to touch her, as if she might break. "The dose in the 4 bag has already started," Yuganma said, looking at the clear plastic bag hanging above the bed. "The nurse must have started it early to make sure it was finished by midnight. Her heart rate is already dropping." The monitor began to change. The beep became slower. "Beep. Beep. Fix it," Hyunwoo commanded. He looked at Yuganma with a mix of desperation and hope. "Whatever you need, just fix it." Yuganma's mind went into high gear. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was the head of a medical team. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a cabinet full of medical supplies. "I need calcium gluconate," she said firmly. "And I need a fresh bag of saline. Now." One of the guards rushed to the cabinet. Yuganma moved with a speed she hadn't felt in years. She didn't have a lab coat, but her hands were steady. She knew that the drug Mr. Park had chosen worked by blocking the calcium in the heart. To save the girl, she had to flood her system with the opposite. It was a simple chemical balance, but if she gave too much, it could be just as dangerous. She clamped the tube on the poison 4 bag, cutting off the flow of the lethal prescription. With a quick, practiced motion, she swapped it for the fresh saline. Then, she prepared the calcium. She watched the monitor, her breath held in her lungs. "Come on," she whispered. "Fight it." The room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Hyunwoo stood like a shadow, watching Yuganma's every move. He saw the way she handled the medicine, not like a servant, but like a master of her craft. Slowly, the monitor began to pick up speed. Beep, beep, beep. The line on the screen became a steady mountain range again. The color began to return to the little girl's cheeks. She stirred in her sleep, her small hand reaching out to grab the edge of the blanket. Yuganma let out a long, shaky breath. She stepped back from the bed, her forehead damp with sweat. The poison is being washed out of her system. She's going to be okay. She'll wake up in the morning feeling tired, but her heart is strong again. Hyunwoo Choi sank into a chair by the bed. For the first time that night, the iron mask on his face cracked. He reached out and gently took his daughter's hand. He stayed like that for a long time, just watching her breathe. Outside in the hallway, the sound of the nurse being dragged away faded into silence. The associate's plan had completely crumbled. The medical accident had been stopped by the one person nobody thought to count, the woman who had been hired to clear the plates. Hyunwoo stood up and walked toward Yuganma. He looked at her uniform, which was now wrinkled and stained with a bit of saline. He looked at her hands, which were finally still. "Mr. Park thought you were a ghost," Hyunwoo said quietly. "He thought he could talk right through you because you wore a vest and carried a tray." "Most people do," Yuganma said. "I won't make that mistake," Hyunwoo replied. He looked at the medical tray, then back at her. "You saved the only thing in this world that matters to me. A simple thank you is not enough for a woman of your talents." He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. "The people who blacklisted you. The ones who turned a brilliant doctor into a waitress. They think they are powerful, but they haven't met me yet." Yuganma felt a strange tingle of hope. For 3 years, she had been running from her past, trying to hide from the people who had crushed her. But standing in this room, she realized she didn't want to hide anymore. She had used her voice, and it had saved a life. "What happens now?" she asked. Hyunwoo turned to face her. "Now we settle your debts. And then we give you a new uniform. One that people will finally have to respect." The sun was just beginning to peek over the city buildings when Hyunwoo Choi led Yuganma into a private office on the top floor of his home. The room was filled with tall bookshelves and screens that showed data from all over the world. Yuganma felt out of place in her wrinkled waitress uniform, but Hyunwoo didn't seem to notice. He sat behind a desk made of dark wood and gestured for her to sit. "I have spent the last hour making calls," Hyunwoo said. His voice was calm now, but it had a sharp edge like a razor. "I have learned about the company that took your life away. Vaxcor Pharmaceuticals. They are the ones who put your name on the list." Yuganma felt a shiver at the mention of the name. Vaxcor was a giant. They had more money than some small countries. They were the ones who had sent lawyers to her house and made sure she could never work in a lab again. "They are too powerful, Mr. Choi," she whispered. "They have friends in every government office." Hyunwoo leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on hers. They have friends, he said, but I have partners. And those partners do not like it when people lie to me. He pressed a button on his desk, and a man in a sharp gray suit walked in. He handed Hyunwoo a thick folder. This is the list, the man said. Every hospital, every research center, and every university that received the order to blacklist Dr. Isaac. Yugama's heart skipped a beat when she heard him call her Dr. Isaac. It was a title she hadn't heard in years. It felt like a piece of her soul was being handed back to her. Hyunwoo opened the folder and began to read. VaxCorp told these hospitals that you were dangerous. They told them you stole data and lied about test results. They used their money to buy silence. He looked up at Yugama. But money is a funny thing. It only works if people are afraid of you. And right now, VaxCorp has a lot of reasons to be afraid of me. Over the next few hours, Yugama watched as Hyunwoo dismantled the wall that had been built around her. He didn't use a scalpel. He used a sledgehammer. He called the CEO of VaxCorp directly. He didn't yell or scream. He simply explained that he had proof of their medical accidents and their attempt to murder his daughter through the nurse they had recommended to Mr. Park. I am giving you 10 minutes, Hyunwoo said into the phone, his voice cold as ice. You will send a letter to every name on this list. You will tell them that Dr. Yugama Isaac is a hero. You will tell them that your previous reports were a mistake. If the letters are not sent, I will release the records of every secret deal you have ever made. I will make sure your company is a memory by noon. Yugama watched the clock on the wall. She felt like she was in a dream. She remembered the nights she had spent crying in her tiny apartment, wondering why the world was so unfair. She remembered the feeling of being a uniformed ghost, invisible to the people she served. At exactly 10 minutes past the hour, a notification popped up on one of the large screens. A public statement was being released. VaxCorp was correcting a clerical error. They were praising a former investigator for her bravery and honesty. Then, the emails started coming in. Yugama watched as her personal inbox, the one she hadn't checked in months because it was only full of rejection letters, began to ping. We would like to discuss a position. One read. Please accept our deepest apologies, said another. The weight that had been sitting on Yugama's chest for 3 years finally lifted. It was like she could breathe for the first time. The debt she owed to the world was gone. And the debt the world owed her was finally being paid. Hyunwoo closed the folder and pushed it across the desk toward her. The blacklist is gone, he said. You are no longer a ghost, Yugama. You can go back to your labs. You can go back to your research. You are free. Yugama looked at the folder, then at the man sitting across from her. She thought about the quiet life she had lived, hiding in the shadows of the lounge. She thought about the girl she had saved and the truth she had uncovered. I don't think I want to go back to the way things were, Yugama said, her voice growing stronger. The labs are full of people who stayed quiet while I was erased. They are full of people who care more about money than ethics. Hyunwoo smiled, a small, knowing look. I was hoping you would say that. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city he helped control. I have plenty of doctors, Yugama. I have plenty of scientists. But I do not have anyone who can see a lie before it is told. I do not have anyone who can look at a glass of wine and see a murder. He turned back to her. The world is full of snakes. I need someone to be my moral compass. I need someone to tell me when the path I am walking is the wrong one. You saved my daughter because you refused to follow the rules. I want you to keep refusing. Yugama looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. She reached out and touched the folder, then looked up at Hyunwoo. The waitress was gone. The doctor was back. But she was something new now, something more powerful. Yugama stood in front of the tall mirror in her new office. The stiff white waitress shirt and the black vest were gone. In their place, she wore a suit the color of midnight, tailored perfectly to her frame. She looked at her reflection and didn't see a ghost anymore. She saw a woman who had reclaimed her name. She was Dr. Yugama Isaac, but to the people in this building, she was something more. She was the woman who saw the truth. Her new office was at the very center of Hyunwoo's headquarters. It was a bridge between the sterile world of medicine and the dark, complicated world of Hyunwoo's business. On her desk sat a new computer and a stack of files that would have made her old self shiver. These weren't just medical reports. They were the blueprints of a powerful empire. A soft chime sounded at her door. Come in, Yugama said. Her voice was calm and carried a new kind of authority. Hyunwoo Choi walked in. He looked different than he had in the dimly lit lounge. In the sunlight, the tattoos on his neck looked like ancient symbols of a life spent in battle. He placed a thick document on her desk. "This is the contract for the new medical distribution center," Hyunwoo said. "My advisors say it will make us millions. They say it is a perfect deal." Yugama didn't look at the money or the signatures. She opened the file and began to read. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning the fine print. She wasn't looking for profits. She was looking for the chemistry of the deal. She looked for the names of the suppliers, the origins of the chemicals, and the history of the people involved. For 10 minutes, the room was silent. Hyunwoo waited. He didn't rush her. He didn't tell her how much the deal mattered. He simply stood there, trusting the woman who had saved his daughter. "The deal is a trap," Yugama said, finally looking up. She pointed to a small clause buried on page 42. "This supplier is using a cheaper factory in a country with no safety laws. The medicine they want to distribute will be weak. It won't kill people like the associate's poison, but it won't cure them either. You would be selling hope that doesn't work." Hyunwoo narrowed his eyes. "My experts didn't see that." "Your experts were looking at the gold," Yugama replied, standing up. "I am looking at the soul. If you sign this, you are no better than VaxCorp. You would be building your empire on the backs of the sick." Hyunwoo stared at the file for a long moment. Then, without a word, he picked it up and tore the signature page in half. He tossed the pieces into the trash can. "Then we find a better way," he said. "That is why you are here." As the weeks passed, Yugama became the moral compass of the organization. She was the one who vetted every partner and checked every shipment. She was no longer invisible. When she walked down the hallways, men in suits stepped aside for her. They didn't do it because they were afraid of her title. They did it because they knew she could see through any mask they wore. She still visited Hyunwoo's daughter every week. The little girl was healthy now, her cheeks rosy and her laughter filling the halls of the great stone house. Every time Yugama saw her, she was reminded of why she had chosen to speak up in that dark booth. She had lost her old life, but she had gained a purpose that was far greater. One evening, as she was leaving her office, she saw her old manager from the lounge standing in the lobby. He was there to deliver a shipment of catering for a meeting. When he saw Yugama, his eyes went wide. He dropped his clipboard, his face turning pale as he recognized the uniformed ghost in her expensive suit. Yugama stopped in front of him. For a second, she remembered the smell of the kitchen and the weight of the silver tray. She remembered how it felt to be a non-entity. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked in English, her voice smooth and kind. "Dr. Isaac," the manager stammered, his voice shaking. I didn't know. I am so sorry for what I said that night. I was just following the rules." Yugama smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone who had learned that rules are often just cages for the truth. "The rules are easy to follow," she said. "It's the truth that's hard. I hope the service at the lounge is still excellent." She walked past him and headed toward the glass doors where a car was waiting for her. She wasn't running away anymore. She wasn't hiding her brilliance or her Nigerian heritage or her medical degree. She was using all of it to navigate a world that was often dark and dangerous. As the car pulled away, Yugama looked out at the city. She knew that there would be more snakes and more betrayals. She knew that being the moral compass for a man like Hyunwoo Choi would never be easy. But as she touched the stethoscope she now kept in her bag, she knew she was ready. The waitress was gone. The ghost had found her voice. And in a world built on lies, Yugama Isaac was finally the one holding the light.